Bad Hamburg, Germany. A small patch of grass. Not center court. Not the kind of place where history is supposed to unfold. But on June 24th, something quiet and significant begins to take shape. On one side of the net, a 21-year-old who just claimed the Birmingham title, who walked onto a grass court in Berlin and dismantled the world number 2 without asking anyone's permission. On the other side, not an opponent, a partner. Venus Williams. 46 years old. 7 Grand Slam singles titles. A name that doesn't need a sentence to explain itself. For the first time in their careers, they stand on the same side of the net. Same direction. Same strategy. Same outcome. Everyone calls it a beautiful story. A viral moment. Generation meeting generation. But if you look just a little closer, a question surfaces that nobody quite answers.
Why?
Let's do the math. Venus Williams turned professional in 1994. Alex Eala was born in 2005. 11 years separate those two facts, and 11 years in tennis isn't just an age gap. It's 2 entirely different worlds. Venus learned the game in an era before social media existed to dissect every shot, every expression, every breath between points. Eala grew up in an era where a single backhand could be clipped, captioned, and circulated globally within seconds of landing. One player was shaped in relative silence. The other was forged under a constant camera lens. And now those 2 worlds share one court, one ball, one set of consequences. Eala's story, if you haven't been watching closely, has accelerated fast. A title in Birmingham, then Berlin, where she did something very few players her age have ever done. She defeated Elena Rybakina, world number 2, on grass. No commentary needed after that result. The performance spoke for itself. You don't need a legend to validate what the scoreboard already says. But it turns out a legend was paying attention anyway. Venus Williams needs no introduction, but the Venus Williams of 2026 is a different chapter from the one most people remember. This is not a legend returning for a ceremonial lap. This is a 46-year-old athlete genuinely competing, round after round, with no guarantees attached to her name. Months ago, she played singles in Madrid. She lost in the first round. No fanfare, no courtesy. Just an athlete trying to rediscover her rhythm, match by match, on her own terms. And then, in the middle of that process, she chose a partner. Not a veteran from her generation. Not a safe, predictable choice designed to minimize risk. She chose Eala. This is where the story becomes more interesting than the headline suggests. Because if you imagine this as a perfectly orchestrated media moment, the reality is considerably messier. Just hours before they walked onto that court together, both had lost. Eala fell in the first round of singles in straight sets to Elise Mertens. Venus dropped a tense 3-set match in the same round. 2 players. The same day. The same compound of courts. 2 separate defeats. And then they stepped out together. Not in triumph. Not after a shared victory to photograph for the social feed. Right after 2 losses, 2 private disappointments, standing side by side on the same patch of grass. You could call it coincidence. Or you could begin to ask a different question entirely. Is this moment really about beauty? Or is it about necessity? Something both of them, for very different reasons, need right now. They lost differently. Eala's loss to Mertens had no single moment to point at. No dramatic collapse, no turning point to blame. Just a seasoned opponent who understood how to dismantle her rhythm and a body carrying the weight of 4 consecutive tournaments on the calendar's most demanding stretch of grass court season. Venus's loss was something else. 3 sets. A match that went deep into the final tiebreak. Not the exit of a player who had run out of fuel, but the exit of a player who still had enough, just not quite enough to win. 2 kinds of defeat. 2 completely different stories about the same bad afternoon. And a few hours later, they walked out together. The tactical conversation is where things get genuinely complex, because their styles don't just differ by generation, they differ by philosophy. Venus is a product of an era where going to the net wasn't a strategic option. It was instinct. Serve, advance, close the point before your opponent has time to construct an answer. Tennis built on occupying space before the other person can react. Eala is a product of the modern baseline era. Deep ground strokes, calculated to the millimeter. She doesn't rush the net. She waits. She builds pressure through ball speed, maneuvering opponents out of position before deciding to strike. One player controls space. The other controls time. Combining those two philosophies into a single cohesive doubles partnership is not a matter of simply adding two capable players together. It's a live adaptation process, happening in real time, on a court where there is no pause button. And this is where the psychological dimension becomes the most compelling part. Doubles is not a natural extension of singles tennis. Singles is a solitary pursuit. You stand alone. You carry every point. Every wrong decision lands entirely on your own shoulders. Doubles demands something different. It asks you to believe that the person beside you will be in the right position. It asks you to accept that the outcome sometimes leaves your hands entirely and enters someone else's. For Eala, who has spent recent weeks with every eye in the room trained exclusively on her, entering a competitive relationship where control is divided carries real psychological weight. There are two ways to read that choice. The first, it's relief. Standing beside someone who has stood at the summit of this sport, 5 Wimbledon titles, a career that outlasted entire generations of opponents, can give a young player permission to momentarily release the pressure of proving herself. Room to breathe between points. Room to believe. The second, less comfortable reading, avoidance. If form is wavering, if the body is accumulating fatigue, then adding another match, a new partner, new variables, is that genuine preparation? Or is it a way of not quite looking directly at what's happening? No one has a definitive answer to that question. Perhaps not even Eala herself. But the timing of the decision was not accidental. Wimbledon is 5 days away. And for the first time in her career, Eala will enter that tournament as a seeded player. No longer an outsider. No longer a name no one watches until she wins. This time, the attention precedes her. That is an entirely different kind of pressure. Not the weight of an unknown trying to prove something, but the weight of someone already recognized, now asked to live up to it. In the middle of all of that, she chose to walk onto a court beside someone who knew this pressure long before she did. Perhaps that's wisdom. Perhaps Venus, more than anyone on tour right now, understands what it feels like to be watched from the opening point, and perhaps, without a word being said, she's passing something of that understanding along. Before the match itself, there's a small image worth pausing on. 2 players sitting on a bench, waiting for the referee to call their names. Neither spoke much. Venus tied her shoelaces. Eala looked out at the court, the stands only partially filled. There was nothing cinematic about the moment. Just a very ordinary, very human pause before everything began. Then it started. Venus served first, and within the opening minutes, one thing became immediately clear. This was not a photo opportunity. They played like 2 people who genuinely wanted to win. Eala read Venus's serves quickly, moved cleanly, reacted with instinct. Venus at the net read the geometry of the game and covered the gaps a younger player might leave open. There was no awkwardness. No hesitation of the kind that appears when 2 people are simply paired out of convenience. There was something surprisingly natural between them, as if they hadn't just met. Midway through the first set, Eala returned a heavy serve directly at Venus's feet. Venus met it with a barely there touch, angling the ball into the exact space the opponent had just vacated. They looked at each other for a moment. No words, but something was understood. That kind of nonverbal communication only exists between people who can truly read each other's rhythm. It is not manufactured. It either appears or it doesn't. And just as the match began to find its pace, just as the viewer began to forget the original question, it returned, more insistently than before. If this chemistry is real, if 2 players separated by 25 years can genuinely find each other's rhythm this quickly, what does that say about what they are actually searching for in each other? Now, let's return to the question this video opened with. Why now? There is a surface answer, and there is a truer one. On the surface, their schedules aligned. Both needed a doubles partner before Wimbledon. It was a practical arrangement between 2 professionals preparing for the same tournament. That is true. But it is not the whole truth. Because if it were only logistics, no one would stop to ask why. The question wouldn't exist. Consider where each of them stands within her own story. Venus Williams does not need another title. 7 Grand Slam singles titles, 14 Grand Slam doubles titles, a career whose most important chapters have long been written. She does not compete because she has something left to prove. She competes because she still wants to compete. That is an enormous distinction, one that tends to get lost in the noise around her name. There is a kind of freedom that only becomes available when the pressure to prove yourself has dissolved. When winning or losing no longer determines your worth, you play because you want the experience. Nothing more, nothing less. Eala is not there yet. She may not be there for a long time. Right now, every match carries its own weight, the weight of building, of proving, of maintaining a position only just achieved. And so, perhaps, this is what is actually happening on that small court in Bad Hamburg. Not a legend bestowing a gift upon a young talent, but something quieter. Someone who has completed the full arc of this career standing beside someone who has only just begun to walk it, and in those few hours, without announcement, showing the other a version of this sport that is not burdened by individual results. It wasn't a lecture. Venus did not sit down and explain how to manage pressure. She didn't need to. The lesson, if there is one, lives in the way Venus moves on a tennis court. Calm, unhurried, precise, regardless of the score. In the way she handles a lost point without allowing it to darken the next one. In the way she smiles genuinely after a missed shot, because 32 years in this sport have taught her that a single point does not define a person. Eala is at an age where every defeat still carries the feeling of a verdict. Perhaps that is exactly what she needs right now. Not a doubles partner to fill another slot on her schedule, but a living demonstration, right beside her, of what it looks like to still love this sport, after all the years, after all the pressure, after all the expectation. So, what is the real answer to the original question? This is not an escape from the pressure of Wimbledon. It is a different kind of preparation. Not tactical, not physical, mental. A way of approaching the most important tournament of the summer, not alone with the weight of everything at stake, but carrying a recent memory of how good it can feel to simply compete, even when everything else matters. In 5 days, Eala enters Wimbledon for the first time as a seeded player. For the first time with expectations walking ahead of her rather than following behind. What she brings into that arena could be the form she showed in Berlin. It could be the bruise of 2 consecutive defeats. But it might also be something smaller, harder to measure. A reminder, wordless, unplanned, of what it looks like when a 46-year-old steps onto a grass court not because she needs to win, but because she still wants to play. That is not a tactic anyone writes in a coaching notebook. It is something that can only be absorbed when you are close enough to someone who has already lived through everything you are afraid of. Legacy is not transmitted through a single statement, a rehearsed lesson, or a moment staged for the camera. It passes through what people witness without meaning to. In unscripted moments, when no one needs to perform. A legend tying her shoelaces on a bench in a secondary arena. No center court, no full stands. A young player sitting beside her, watching quietly. Not because anyone told her to study, but because some things can only be learned if you are fortunate enough to be in the room when they happen. Wimbledon is coming. And perhaps, just perhaps, Eala will walk through those gates as a slightly different person than the one who left Berlin with a loss in her hands. Not because of something that was taught, but because of something that was seen.